Our missionary to the prayer room. She comes every day. That's her job. Opens the prayer room and stays in there and prays and intercedes. And I know God's put something.
For those who are saying that there is no God, let them know right now in the Spirit that God is alive and they're sensing Him right now. Holy Spirit, I just feel that they're sensing you. They're sensing and feeling the anointing. And I just pray, my God, that your presence would surpass any thinking, any mindsets, my God, that they might have, any scientific foolishness that they may have, Father God. I pray that they know right now, and they can say all they want that you're not alive, but they feel you deep in their soul. They feel you, my God, deep in their soul, because their spirit is being touched right now, God. In Jesus' name. In Jesus' name. Come on, Jesus. Hallelujah. In the name of Jesus.
Hi. How are you guys? This is so awesome. This is our first time having like a big public kind of event in Manteca. Certainly the first thing we've done in the year. We often have these kinds of events in Stockton at Pacific's campus and at CSU Stanislaus. We decided, we got people in our group from all over the Central Valley. Manteca is a nice central place, and for those of you who live here, thank you for paying for this library with your tax dollars. This is an awesome resource to have. There was an article in I think it was today's Manteca Bulletin that specifically mentioned the library and how great it is that we can have events like this here in this building and right across, I don't know which direction I'm facing, that way at the park with the church groups that are there. It really says a lot, I think, in terms of the First Amendment and free speech, that we don't have to worry about living in a country where we can't do stuff like this. It doesn't matter to me what your religious background is, if you're an atheist, agnostic, if you're Christian, Muslim, Jew, Sikh, whatever it is. How about a round of applause just for the library and letting us be here today? And of course to our Constitution and our country that made all this happen. I want to thank you guys so much for coming out here today. How many people are already a member, whatever that means, of one of our local atheist humanist groups? Anybody? Cool. And so I want to re-welcome you then to our community. And for everybody else who you are new to this, you're checking it out, you're just a little curious about what we have to say today, thank you so much for coming and taking some time out of your evening. I know it's a little late, but how awesome is it for you guys to want to learn more about what atheists do and believe, and a little bit about their culture and their worldview, some of the stuff that, for example, Professor McCormick is here to talk about as well. And so my hat's off to you, especially if you are a religious person, for coming out here just to see what we're all about. I wanted to thank the Stanislaus Humanists and Troy and his group that we're partnering up with. I'm with the Stockton area atheists and freethinkers, and Troy, which we'll talk to you in just a minute, is with the Stanislaus Humanists, and we've kind of really just worked together right in the middle of the two areas here in Manteca to make this event happen. We already thanked Manteca Library, and Matt, thank you so much. Matt has come down here. And for those of you who are here with the Place of Refuge and Christian Worship Center, thank you. I didn't get a chance to go over there. I know Matt did and a couple others did. Thank you for the coffee and the hot chocolate, and they seem to have some entertainment going out there, which we couldn't catch. But if you are from any of those groups, or you know from folks who are from those groups, please express our thanks for making this an even bigger, better community event. Our groups, both the Stanislaus Humanists and the Stockton area atheists and freethinkers, we're non-believers, but that doesn't mean that we don't like hanging out with other people. But we're not going to go to church to do it, and we have to find some way to be social with other people. And that's at least from my perspective, the core of our group. We need an excuse sometimes just to get together and have fun, to learn, to enrich our lives, maybe to look for volunteer opportunities or to find other people within a network that shares the same worldviews that we can maybe lean our shoulders on every now and then and help each other out. And that's really what our groups are about. And those of you who come here from religious backgrounds, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of us may go to church for the religious part of it, but I think a lot of us also maybe go to church for the social part of it and all the other good things that are tied into that. And I think it's something that's really important, and that's something that our group really has built itself upon and around. We have a bunch of upcoming events, and I'm not going to bore everybody here with every single date and time. I'm just going to say that we do some really cool, fun stuff. We have brunches, we have book clubs, and Charlie, thank you for hosting those, and game nights. Vincent and Brett, I don't think I see you here today. We have family events where we go hang out with the kids to all kinds of different stuff. We have educational, discussional things like we're doing tonight. We're even starting a wine and art hop event up in Lodi with the first Fridays that they have there. I'm excited about that one. Volunteer things, you know, we clean up parks every now and then. We're trying to do something on 99 with the highway cleanup. So we got a lot of stuff going on. And I want to mention real quick, there's a giant, huge event. For anybody that is in some way a part of this free thought movement, there's something called Free Thought Day up in Sacramento. This will be our 13th or 12th or something. Anyway, it's October 12th. And last year we had about 300 people, awesome speakers, full day event, stuff for kids to do, live music, entertainment, all that kind of stuff. So again, there's a lot going on if you want to be a part of our community or check us out. Events like the one we're having tonight with Matt, we're going to keep doing right here in the library, unless we outgrow it. I'm surprised to see so many people here. And we have some really cool upcoming speakers. Simply enough, on the calendar, it's just the third Wednesday of every other month. Simply enough. They're all going to be free. We've got Richard Carrier coming in, who's written a number of books about the religiosity of the Bible, and especially the New Testament. David Fitzgerald, Greta Christina, Peter Bakhassian, who just came out with a really provocative book about converting people to atheists. That'll be an interesting one. And then from UC Merced, Professor David Noel is going to come back and talk to us again. So it's always in the library, the third Wednesday of every other month, all the odd-numbered months. And so for when you get back at home, or if you just want to get onto your phone real quick, Stockton AAF, Area Atheists and Freethinkers.org. That's one of our websites. We're also on Facebook if you just search for Stockton Atheists. All of our events, you can RSVP there, you can chat there, all kinds of stuff. And then, as well as the Humanist group, that focuses mostly on the Stanislaus area, StanislausHumanists.org. And they list all their events up on there. You can go to Facebook and learn more about that. And Troy will tell you more about that group as well. I want to ask, and for those of you who come from a church background, you know the part where the pastor asks for you to reach deep into your wallet and to support. And we're not going to pass the plate. I promise that. But we do have expenses. And just like any other thing, if you go to the movies, there's expense. If you go out to dinner, concert, whatever it is, you know the drill. I'm not going to... Anyway, if you feel so inclined, we have insurance that we have to pay for. Thankfully, the room itself is free, but we had to put up a pretty good policy for that. We have advertising. We have buttons that we make, which are welcome to help yourself to out there. And we'd love to continue and do much more. And if you'd like to help us out, there is a jar on your way out, and anything would be great to support us, and I'd appreciate that as well. And one last announcement I want to make is for those of you who have children, there's a really special organization called Camp Quest. They have 2 camp facilities here in California, and the one closest to us is up near Nevada City. And for 1 week, about 100 kids are going to get together and learn about science, about free thought, about humanism, evolution, scientific method, peer review, skepticism, all while having fun outdoors with traditional stuff like your archery and your hiking and your swimming and s'mores and sing-alongs and campfires and astronomy. And so if you have kids that are between 8 to 17, or you know anybody that does, tell them about Camp Quest. And they can go online to the website and learn more about it. If you're inclined to volunteer, because you love kids, you love science, you can talk to me or go to the website about it. If you want to help us out financially, every dollar that Camp Quest receives as a donation goes right into what we call camperships for families that can't afford to send their kids to the camp. And so again, you can ask me later on about it, I don't want to dwell, but Camp Quest is a really, really special program, especially for kids that grow up in rural areas where they're pretty much the only atheist, non-religious person in town. And so it's special for these kids to go and be around other people that share the same worldviews that they do. So anyway, I want to bring Troy up for just a second to talk to you about can I use the word resurrected? Is that okay to say in this group? A resurrected group from what used to be the Stanislaus skeptics to now the Stanislaus humanists. I'd like to introduce Troy to everybody, and Troy to tell us a little bit about his group.
Hi, thank you. Pretty much you covered it. We have like a little about us pamphlet that I just created an hour ago.
They aren't that new.
Yeah. And our next event is a film discussion at my house. It's about the peak oil, the end of oil, and what we're going to do about it. It's called A Crude Awakening. We have it in my, basically my home theater, and then whoever disagrees with the film gets to start the discussion afterwards. Yeah, because, I mean, you've got an hour and a half of brainwashing. Let the other side speak. And actually, one of the things that I'm really impressed with is I think that it's great that the people turned out at the park. We know that according to recent Pew surveys, that nuns, people that don't have any religious affiliation, are the fastest growing religious minority or metaphysical minority. And it would be nice, both of the groups are trying to basically let people know we're here so that people can show up, and maybe when there's an issue that affects us, we can turn out in numbers and have singing and cocoa. So anyway, I would urge you to pick up one of these. We're just starting out. We just got a board of directors. We're a nonprofit organization, and
You got your 501c3?
we got, well, we're using
You're in the process of? Or you're using the
we're using the AHA, the American Humanist Association. So anyway, I'd just like to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
That's it. And so we're at the key point where I get to introduce our speaker, and thank you again for driving all the way down here. Matthew, didn't mean to cover that up. Matt is a professor up at Sac State and has been teaching courses on all kinds of stuff related to this topic. I think, well, you just said since 1995. So he's got a lot of years as a professor on me than I do. So, but yeah, he's a professor of philosophy of religion and a professor of atheism, which I'm pretty jealous of. I think that's pretty awesome to have that. He's got all kinds of videos up on YouTube. He's got a blog called Proving the Negative. He just came out with a book. There it is, or not just, but about a year ago or so. Atheism, the Case Against Christ. And I asked him to bring some so we could sell some and make some money, but he was too modest to do it. But it is available on Amazon.com for Kindle or for regular paper, whatever that is. And he's also the advisor of the Secular Student Alliance chapter affiliate up in Sacramento. And I know back here there's Dan, who's also a member of that group, and I saw some other members as well. And thank you guys for making the trip all the way down as well. So I'm done rambling. Let's switch the computers over and give the floor to Matthew. Thank you guys again for coming, and over to you.
Thank you. Before I talk, there's lots of people who do lots of work down here, but one person I do know about, getting emails from him midnight and the like, and he's incredibly active, is I want to give David a hand for the massive amount of work he does down here. I've been watching him do a lot of work for a lot of years in the whole area, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate what you guys are doing too. So I'm going to give a talk that comes out of an idea I had several years ago that went into the book. And I'm going to switch it up at the end here and talk about some psychology research. But I'll just dive in here and we'll get started. A bit of shameless self-promotion. There's the book. The publisher had sent me a whole case of them, but I had to send them back after they sat in my office for a while, after I sold as many as I thought I was going to sell. So I didn't bring it tonight, but it is on Amazon if you're interested. So I want to talk about the resurrection tonight. I want to talk about resurrection beliefs in America. So obviously, there's a huge majority of Americans are Christians. 78% are Christians, 77% believe that Jesus was executed and came back from the dead, a literal resurrection in this case. The resurrection is obviously the cornerstone of the Christian doctrine. It provides for the Christian salvation scheme. It's a part of the essential doctrine of unification with God. It's for atonement. It plays this huge role. So, simple question, why do so many people believe it? Well, if you ask Americans about this, they'll say, pretty simply, well, it's because the Bible says it, right? So 30% of Americans will say that the Bible is literally true, that it describes the actual factual state of affairs. And the polling data here is always funny. It depends on how you ask and where you ask and when you ask. And you get different sort of results, because when you do other sorts of polling, you ask about young earth creationism, for instance. How many Americans think that the earth and all life on earth were all created in their more or less present form within the last 10,000 years? You'll get 40% or more Americans will say yes to that claim. So somewhere in that neighborhood, a lot of people believe this, and another very large chunk of Americans think this, that it's the inspired Word of God. So somehow there's some kind of special access to the truth by way of God's having a hand in this book's getting written. But of course, we got a problem, because being in the Bible is not enough. And I'm going to call this the Spider-Man problem. What do I mean by the Spider-Man problem? Well, look, the mere fact that something appears in a religious document by itself is not enough to establish that it's true. Then we must have some independent grounds for thinking that what the document says is true, because of course the Spider-Man issue says that the Green Goblin died, and the Green Goblin's neither real nor did he die. So the mere fact that it says it isn't enough. Now, when people are confronted with this problem, with this question about, well, why believe what the Bible says, we get typically some variation on this sort of argument. They'll make what I call the historical case for Jesus, historical case for the resurrection. They'll say that we've got sufficient or adequate evidential, historical evidence for thinking that Jesus was resurrected. All right, so for my purposes, what I want to talk about tonight, let's divide up folks who believe in the resurrection. So there's going to be a lot of people who are going to take it on faith. There's going to be a lot of people who take it on some matter of personal revelation, maybe some personal religious experience. And then there's going to be people who say, oh no, we've got good evidence for thinking historically this happened. I'm talking about those folks. So the faith view, the revelation view, the mystical experience view, and all those others, that's a different set of questions we'll have to ask. And then we can talk about those in the question and answers afterwards. So those folks, and there's a lot of them out there, will make some argument along these lines. They will cite, and I'm just going to roughly summarize some of the major virtues of the historical account, some of the major points that typically get made in these kinds of arguments. There's lots of variations on theme here. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of different books that make slightly different historical arguments for this point. For my purposes, the details don't really matter. I'm just going to give you kind of a rough picture of the kind of argument that people make for the historical resurrection, and then I want to offer an objection that will cover all the detailed different cases. All right, so one of the major ones, of course, is people say, well, we've got multiple eyewitness accounts. We've got all these people who saw Jesus come back from the dead. We've got the disciples, we've got maybe the authors of the Gospels, we've got all these people that he performed miracles for. So there's maybe tens, maybe hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people who saw this guy come back from the grave. So that's a big deal, that's significant, that's a piece of evidence we ought to think about. It would have been too difficult, it's been argued, to fake Jesus' death and his resurrection because his execution was so public. It was such a big inflammatory deal, the thing that was going on, the thing that was happening. I'm going to take a second to fix this. It's worrying me, this leg right here. The carpenter in me saw this earlier. I'm stressing out about this. It's going to happen here. There you go. Just bugging me there. Should take care of that. All right, so this argument's been made that it would have been too difficult to fake since Jesus' execution was so public. And of course, you can't have tens or hundreds of people mass hallucinating the same thing. You couldn't possibly have had all these different people have all had a delusion or an imaginary experience or some kind of hallucination and all hallucinated the same thing. And we've got these different accounts that all seem to say the same thing. The witnesses wouldn't have had any ulterior motives. Since reporting it would get them persecuted. Why would these people, I can hear the voice of some of the people I know who subscribe to this view. Why would they put themselves at such risk? Why would they come out and say that this Jesus, this character had been resurrected, when saying that would have been so revolutionary, would have been so dangerous, it would have gotten them persecuted or killed, and it would have been so risky to them? Why would they have done that if it hadn't been something that was had a profound impact on them, and they didn't really believe it? Their sincerity, the genuineness of their conviction, surely that counts for lending some credibility to this thing they're saying, because they wouldn't have done it otherwise, right? So let me, there's more. They gave up their jobs and their possessions to follow Jesus. There's some other New Testament events that have been historically corroborated: the reign of Herod, the destruction of the temple, the growth of the early church, and that helps us triangulate. We can say, well, if the Bible's right about these things, then it's probably right about these other things. We can trust it for this, then it's trustworthy overall, or something along those lines. This is a bizarre sort of, just an editorial aside here. This strikes me as a really bizarre comment, but I saw this argued in earnest at great length in a very influential book. The Jews could not have come up with the resurrection idea on their own. They couldn't have made it up. It wasn't part of their culture or their current idea set, so they wouldn't have imagined such a thing. It seems implausible, argue some of the folks in this camp. Jewish oral history can be trusted. There's a tradition of rabbis passing on important information to the next generation that we know has been corroborated through other historical methods, and we can trust that method of oral transmission. So that gives us some reason for believing it. So overall, when you take all of these 10 or so reasons, plus the stacks and stacks of books arguing for a number of other detailed reasons, the argument goes, well, overall the best explanation here is that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Roughly speaking, you get people making that kind of historical argument to say this is a historical fact. We know this the same way that we know that Abe Lincoln was shot by, I almost said Lee Harvey Oswald. I shouldn't have made this up off the top of my head. Booth, John Wilkes Booth, thank you. We know that Jesus was resurrected from the dead the same way we know historical facts about Lincoln's death, right? So if we can trust a historical method in those cases, then we can trust them in this case, and therefore we ought to believe it. That's the way the historical argument goes. You get the point. All right, so let me give you some, what I take to be largely uncontested facts about the book itself. Now, some folks get quite bent out of shape when they hear these claims, but trust me, I've gone and asked every responsible, careful, thoughtful, middle-of-the-road historian and religious studies scholar I can find, and this is the ordinary, mundane sort of stuff that you learn when you take an Introduction to the New Testament course in college or divinity school or whatever. These are just sort of widely accepted claims across the board amongst historians who study this work. Things like this. We figure that Jesus, if there was such a character, and there is a live debate about whether or not there actually was a guy Jesus. I'm not going to take that one on. But we figured that if there was this guy, he was executed around 35. Mark was written about 30 to 35 years later. Matthew, Luke, and John, the Gospels, were written another 5 to 35 years after that. So we're actually looking at, for John especially, and some people put John as late as 125, we're actually looking at 90 to 100 years past between when the event happens and when it actually gets written down. Like I say, now this is not controversial in the history department, but when you tell some folks this, they get quite bent out of shape. Matthew and Luke, it's widely thought, primarily copied their material from Mark. So you get in trouble in college for cheating doing this. This is called plagiarism. But they lifted the story from Mark into Matthew and Luke. And people know this because you can line them up and you can look sort of line by line and see how they went in. And we know that Matthew and Luke are later than Mark. So they used Mark, and it's been argued that they also used another source that we don't have anymore. Sometimes they call that the Q source. There might be multiple sources, but there's been an argument made that there's just one other source. So that the authors of Matthew and Luke sat down and took Mark and maybe some other sources and copied those down, and that ends up being the gospel according to Matthew and Luke. And John is yet another independent line here. The authors, we don't think, were eyewitnesses. For one thing, there's too many years passed. We've got decades passing, in some cases 70 years passed between the events and when they got written down. And of course, average lifespan in the first century was maybe 29 years. Nobody lives to ripe old age of 70, 80. It's exceedingly unlikely that people lived to those ripe old ages in the first century. So we don't think that the authors were the eyewitnesses. What happened was, in later years, these Gospels get attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the disciples. So we say, oh, this is the Gospel according to Matthew. And later, this gets sort of deemed as the story as Matthew saw it, but we don't have any real reason, we don't have real evidence for thinking that Matthew, the disciple, wrote the thing. We think that someone else wrote it on his behalf, perhaps much later. We don't know how many people the stories passed through between 35 and 65, or 35 and 100, or 35 and whatever. When the stories get written down, we don't know how many times, if we have the event, and one person watches the event, and then he talks and talks and talks and talks and talks, and we don't know in the intervening years between those decades how many people that went through before it got to the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We just don't know how many. It could be 2 people, it could be 1 person, it could be 200 people. We just don't know. We don't have information about that because they weren't written down for several decades, so it's all speculation about it. The ending of Mark, and this is quite remarkable. I went downstairs to my history department friend when I found this out, and he said, oh yeah, everybody knows this. This is obvious. And I just lost my mind when I found this out. The ending of Mark, and you pick up any sort of responsible college textbook on the New Testament, and they all corroborate this. The ending of Mark, starting at about, I think it's probably the 16th chapter. It's actually where the resurrection stuff starts happening. Jesus comes back and all these other events happen. That ending was added to the original manuscript, and that was added about 125 to 150 years later. So the primary document that we're talking about, that was the source that Matthew and Luke draw from, that has this full account of the whole, and I don't know how much you guys know about the full story here, but if you read through Mark, the last part is about the resurrected Jesus coming back and saying all these important messages, and he scolds Doubting Thomas and all these other events. All of that's added 125 years later. And I was like, I guess I'm still freaking out about it. I asked my friend in the history department about that, and he said, yeah, we all know that. Everybody knows that. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? I can't believe this. 125 years? I can't remember what happened to me yesterday. Sorry. Okay, so we don't have any of the original Gospels. And this is also really quite remarkable, because I got to wondering, okay, well, can I actually lay my hands on something? Well, I didn't, no pun intended, but is there something that I could have direct contact with? Because, I just sketched out this picture, so something happens, and then somebody sees it and talks 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 and talks, and then that dude, 40 years later, writes something down. And now here's me in 2012, when I was thinking about this first, trying to get over the centuries. Trying to close the gap between me and Jesus. I want to get as close to Jesus as I can. So I thought, well, what's the closest piece of things, something you could actually lay my hands on, I could look at, that would get me as close as possible to Jesus? It turns out that the Gospels, even though they were written in 65 and thereafter, we don't actually have the original Gospels. And this came as a shock to me, too. I was just sort of a novice learning all of this stuff. We don't have the actual first document. We've got copies of copies of copies of copies of that first document because the materials that they used in the first century didn't survive very long. And it wasn't until the 2nd and 3rd century that they started using writing materials that would last. So actually some of the oldest stuff we have is from 250, 275. There's a Vatican vault that's got a shoebox full, well, probably a shoebox, but there's a Vatican vault that's got a box that's full of some fragments, little ashy, torn up, fragmented pieces of something that's a copy of a copy of a copy of whatever it was that got written in 70. So that, I realized, was as close as I could get to Jesus, assuming the Vatican would let me come in to look at it. As close as I could get to Jesus would be 250, 275, thereabouts. So that gets me within, 230 years of this guy. And even that thing is fragmentary, so it's actually pieces. There's not really any, there's lots of pieces that are missing, there's gaps and chunks that are gone, and it's not until later we get some that are much older that we get the full document that looks like the mark that you pick up when you go to the Bible store. Okay, so that's just scratching the surface on some of the really interesting facts about how the document came to us. Now what can we say about that? Well, okay, so I've been describing what we're calling the historical argument of the resurrection. Well, what if we apply that to some other cases? What if we apply the same standard that's been applied to the Jesus case to some other historical case, like, for instance, the Salem witch trials? And actually I like this because it's even better. Between 1692, sorry for the small print, I'll read it here someday. In the 1690s, there's dozens of people who were arrested, stood trial, and were tortured for sundry acts of witchcraft, possession by devils and other supernatural ill deeds. It started with some strange behavior from some little girls. Ultimately, over 150 people were accused. William Phipps, the governor of Massachusetts, got involved. A court was established. Thorough investigations were conducted. Witnesses were carefully cross-examined. Evidence was gathered. Many people confessed. The entire proceedings were carefully documented with thousands of sworn affidavits, court documents, interviews, and related papers. This is 1692, so now we're talking just a few hundred years ago versus 2,000 years ago. So now, at the end of the day, 19 people, including Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse, get sentenced and executed for magic. So, my question is, was there really magic at Salem? I don't mean, were there people who thought that they were witches, or were there people who were accused of being witches? That happened. But was there actually black magic going on? Was there any spells, or anybody get turned into a newt, or some real supernatural event there? And I think we take it, well, we'll see. Suppose we approach the Salem witch trials the way the resurrection has been treated. I think what happens is that if we take this tack, suppose the accused at Salem were really witches. Now, what happens when you do this comparison? And I think what happens is this. In fact, a comparable case for magic at Salem is better than the case for the resurrection in Jerusalem. And I'm going to show you why. And again, forgive me for the small type, but there's a lot to say here. So here's your two cases. All right, so we got Jerusalem on the left, you got Salem on the right. Now, in Jerusalem, no investigations whatsoever. We get hearsay accounts 30, 40, 60, 70, 100 years later, somebody talking to somebody who wrote it down. No investigation. Salem, thorough and careful investigations. Jerusalem, no eyewitness examinations whatsoever. We just get these hearsay accounts much further down the line. And of course in Salem, we get careful examinations of the eyewitnesses themselves. The people who accused some of those alleged witches of witchcraft, we put them on trial. They put them in a court, and then they stood there and asked them hard, probing questions over and over again, and tried to get clear about exactly what happened. Imagine if we would have been able to do something like that about some of the people who witnessed the alleged resurrection of Jesus. Nothing like that happened. We just get these hearsay accounts much later. Jerusalem, hearsay accounts written 20 to 150 years after the alleged events, unknown authors, unknown other sources, unknown steps to the alleged witnesses. Salem, thousands of primary documents, sworn affidavits, court documents, interviews, and related papers from the actual court cases, and we still have them all. There is a giant section, University of Virginia has a bunch of it, there's a bunch in Massachusetts, where you can actually go and look at the documents yourself. You can look at the confessions by the witches yourself. 4 to 6 case sources of information in the Jerusalem case. I'll even be generous, maybe we expand that out, because we're looking at Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. We've already seen how Matthew and Luke lift some of their material from Mark, John, so there's 4 cases. Some people will say, well, Paul was writing in the decades that follow, and Paul alludes to Jesus' resurrection. Okay, 5, 6, 10, whatever you like. Even if we expand the case a great deal. In Salem, we have direct confessions. We have hundreds of people and sources of information. We have enough information to fill a truck in the Salem case. The actual documents and materials themselves. In Jerusalem, Jesus' followers are alleged by others 30 years later to be dedicated and convinced. This goes the argument. In Salem, witnesses testified with utter conviction that the accused were witches. In Jerusalem, fear of persecution and death would have discouraged lying, trickery, and falsification. In Salem, there's a huge disincentive to lie. Men would lose their lives. Men would lose their wives. Children would lose their mothers. Community members would lose friends. So there's an enormous comparable disincentive to make this thing up. Historical corroborations of many other New Testament events, somebody says, about Jerusalem. That's why we can trust the Bible. Well, we've certainly got thorough corroboration of the Salem witch trials. Extensive and thorough corroboration. They could not have made up the story about something as fantastic as a resurrection, and I suppose you could say something similar about Salem. So many people could not have made up or hallucinated a story as fantastic as this one about the witches. Resurrections are very difficult to fake. Okay, we'll grant the point. Witchcraft would have been very difficult to mistake or fake. So as I take it, by any measure of quantity and quality, I don't get ahead of myself here. If the historical evidence supports the conclusion that Jesus was resurrected, then there's an even better argument to make for magic at Salem. The problem, of course, is that there was no magic at Salem. So what do? If a higher standard of proof on historical evidence can be met, like it can in the Salem case, and it's still not enough to prove witchcraft at Salem, then how is it that such a low standard of proof in Jerusalem lets the resurrection get by? There's something going wrong here with the double standard. The problem that there's no magic at Salem, by any measure of quantity and quality, the evidence for Salem witches is vastly better than the evidence for the resurrection. But you probably don't believe in the resurrection, and there were no real witches at Salem. Salem shows that an even heavier burden of proof can be met, and it remains unreasonable to believe that anything magical happened. So the result is that no clear-headed, consistent, and reasonable person should accept the resurrection on the historical evidence. Now, I haven't said anything to the folks who are going to maintain that they know it on faith, or they know it on the basis of revelation, or they know it on the basis of religious experience. But if somebody wants to say that there's historical evidence for it, they've got the Salem problem to face. And Salem's not the only place. History is full of examples like this, where people in an older time and an older place, where belief in magic and witchcraft and spells and a variety of supernatural or superstitious events were rampant, where their history is full of examples of other cases where we've got lots and lots of information, lots and lots of historical evidence for thinking that the people then thought that this magical event happened. But we don't think that that magical event happened just because of that. Take the Spanish Inquisition, for instance. Or take lots of Joan of Arc, take lots of these other examples. There's all these stories in history. Salem's the one you know about, where you figure there probably weren't any real witches there, but you figure something else went on there. There's all these other cases in history where we have more information than the information we have about Jesus, yet we don't accept the magic claim there. So why would we accept it in the Jesus case? All right, so normally what I do at this point is I consider some responses, some reactions that I typically get to this argument. I'm not going to do that tonight. I think we can save that for the question and answer period. I want to do something else now, because I want to talk about why nobody will accept this argument. I want to talk about why this is completely futile, and this doesn't make any difference. Well, that's stated it too strongly, but here's what I want to talk about. I take this argument, and I'm flattering myself here, but I think this is completely devastating to the historical argument for the resurrection. I've given this discussion to thousands of people. It's in my book. It's out there, and I just have never seen anything that even seems remotely plausible as a plausible objection to the Salem problem. It just seems to me to knock the ball out of the park. No false modesty. So we can talk about those responses in a second if you want, but I want to do something else. The thing is, arguments like this don't have much impact on people. They don't change their minds on the basis of this. In fact, just the opposite seems to happen. When you show somebody like this, they just double down. They just dig in deeper. They don't go, oh, yeah, you're making a good point. Oh, wow, you know what? I hadn't thought about it that way. You know, maybe you're right. People don't do that about religious discussions. Atheists don't do it either, so I'm not just saying this is about religious folks. Humans don't do this about things that they feel strong conviction about. So what's up with that? So I want to talk about why reasoning carefully like this doesn't change anybody's mind, and that means I want to talk about some of the psych research. And I want to talk about something called motivated reasoning. And here's what I think is largely going on when people dig in and resist something like this. And the way to sum it up is just to say, if you don't like it, you figure it's probably false. If it doesn't feel good, if it doesn't feel right, it's got to be wrong. And here's what happens. It's called motivated reasoning. And the rough definition is something like this. People criticize information that's inconsistent with their prior beliefs or preferences more severely. That is, if you've got a belief, you've got something that you already hold dear, you already have some conviction about, and you hear some, what they call preference inconsistent information. If you hear some new information that's contrary to the thing you already believe, you go after that with more skepticism and more severe criticism than other things. And you know you do this. Not just people in the park, everybody in this room does this too. When you're watching the news and some politician from the other party says something, you get out the knives and you tear into that guy. But when your politician says something, you're like, yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. He's awesome. Right? Okay, so you've got a double standard. It's not just a double standard for Jesus. This is a human phenomena. You lower the bar when it's something you like to hear, and you raise the bar, the burden of proof, when it's something you don't like to hear. Okay, that's motivated reasoning. And get my water out here. I'm getting excited. And I'm going to prove it. We could call this the sliding scale fallacy if you like. Or the good one is the umpire effect. And you know about this one. This is actually about capital punishment. I'll tell you the first one, the easy one, and then we'll do the capital punishment one. If you take Stanford fans, like people from Stanford and people from UC Berkeley, and they've got this long-standing rivalry, right, where they'll have a football game or a basketball game, and you have the fans watch the same game. All the Berkeley fans all say that the refs favored Stanford, and all the Stanford fans say that the refs favored Berkeley, right? So it's the same phenomena. It's the same way when you ask people, well, which way does the news tilt? Well, if you're conservative, you figure the news tilts liberal. And if you're liberal, you think the news tilts conservative, right? So that's the umpire effect. That's where, when you're on this side, it feels like it skews your view, your picture of what's going on. And some of the research here is just fascinating, the way they demonstrate how this works in people. You take a group of test subjects who have opinions about capital punishment. So there'll be a group of people who are, suppose it's this room, pro and con capital punishment. And then you show them a bunch of evidence that's mixed both ways. You show them a bunch of studies. You make up some studies that seem to support capital punishment or seem to argue against it. And here's what those people will do. The people who were in favor of it before conclude that the evidence for it is better as a result of the information you gave them. They say, oh, those studies that conclude against capital punishment, those are flawed. So here's what I mean. You take a bunch of folks who have opinions about capital punishment and you give them a mixed body of evidence. Suppose you give them 10 studies and 5 of them are pro and 5 of them are con about capital punishment, and they will criticize the ones that are contrary to their own views, and then they'll get fortified by the stuff that seems to support their view, and they'll select that and go, oh yeah, exactly. And they'll read it all, interpret it as if this mixed body of evidence actually supports their view better. And then the other folks go the other direction. The people who are against it before conclude that the evidence against it is better. Did I get that backwards? Yeah, I got that backwards. They say the studies in favor are flawed. There you go. So they argue. Did I say this last one backwards? Right. Okay, I'll trust you. So it's the same as the Stanford-Berkeley phenomena, right? Where the referees must be biased against our side. So they will criticize the other side and go the other route. Now, what I'm getting at here is I think that there's a very deep-seated resistance to this suggestion that Jesus didn't come back from the dead. And when you really look at the information about Jesus' coming back from the dead, candidly and openly and with a kind of detachment, honestly, it's just ridiculous that someone would suggest that this magical event, that we're certain that this magical event happened on the basis of that information. If nothing else, folks, maybe he was resurrected, but our evidence for it is really shitty. Maybe this would be the ultimate irony, right? Is that Jesus really was resurrected, but we've got that crappy body of evidence in order to prove it. Because the evidence by any reasonable historical standard is really, really poor. But, and that's obvious to somebody who comes out, and there's not many of these people, but it's obvious to somebody who comes at this thing from a detached, sort of without prior commitments view. But when folks who are brought up in believing, having religious views come at it, of course the thing feels much more compelling and much more plausible to them. Or if you're of a fierce skeptical bent, you might go after it more severely on the other side. Now I'm going to call this upside down thinking because here's what I'm getting at. And actually there's a phrase for it. They think this is a good thing. They call it faith-seeking understanding. And this is what somebody, for instance, a first-year divinity school student or somebody who's gone to seminary might feel like, well, what I'm engaged in here is faith-seeking understanding. I have faith, and I'm trying to understand. So I'm trying to question and sustain my faith. So it's believing first and having understanding second is really the important part I'm going to get at here. Now, the less charitable way to put this is to call it defense lawyers for Jesus. And what I mean is, and you may have met some of these folks, it's somebody who says, well, and nobody's going to say this outright. They're not going to say this, probably, well, some of them do. William Lane Craig will say this. But if somebody says, given that I'm not going to relinquish my faith, what I need to do is devise criticisms of all contrary evidence, find rationalization that alleviates the cognitive dissonance. And here's what I mean. I'm going to close this, actually. Hi. You guys want to come and listen? Please do. You want to come and sit down? I just want to close it because of the noise.
No, that's fine. We're fine. Thank you.
Okay, and stay there if you want. That's awesome. Just don't yell or talk and distract me. Is that cool? Yeah, I'm not yelling. They didn't want to come in. So if John Gotti, notorious gangster, gets busted and gets taken to court, he's going to throw a whole bunch of money at his lawyers. And what's he want them to do? What's their job? If you're a defense lawyer for John Gotti, what's your job? Is your job to make sure that justice is served? Is your job to get to the truth? Is your job to figure out what the evidence supports? No. Your job is to get John Gotti off by any legal means or perhaps illegal means necessary. You get him off. And in that context, it sounds, we have kind of a negative attitude about lawyers who might do something like that. But this has been given a kind of gloss of legitimacy by Christian apologetics, where they're very upfront and very open about that this is what they're doing. So if you go to the Talbot School of Theology, where William Lane Craig used to teach, or someplace, they'll say it in their mission statement that what we are doing is we take this to be the primary. We take the Bible, we take these claims to be the foundation, and everything else we do revolves or rotates or orbits around these. And I take it what that means is that we are going to find a way, and William Lane Craig will say this, he will find a way to make anything that comes up fit into this picture. He's not going to, so there's a kind of backwardness to the procedure, and I'll show you what it is. You believe first, and then you reason secondarily. So the belief comes first, and then you reason in order to make the belief fortified or to resolve cognitive dissonance. And in this case, belief is dogmatic, and I don't think that's controversial either when you hear somebody say something like, well, there are no circumstances under which I would change my mind for anything. And that's always a really good question. As I got some modest little level of infamy for my book, I got more and more emails or more people wanting to talk, and there's only so many hours in the day, so at some point I just started asking this question. Well, I want you to just see if you can satisfy a sort of defeasibility test first before we talk. And here's my question. Are there any reasons or evidence or arguments or anything, even hypothetically, that might lead you to revise your beliefs? Would you be prepared to change your mind under any circumstances? Somebody asked, not just to talk about Craig, I think he gets too much attention, but somebody asked him, well, what if we found Jesus's bones in a tomb? And we could prove historically that those are really Jesus's bones. And he said, well, I just have to be sure that that was a mistake. I just know that that was a mistake. And he knows that through some other source. At which point I take it he was leaving the historical argument behind no longer saying the historical evidence proves it. He was saying, no, I'm not going to change my mind under any circumstances. Okay, so that's an important distinction because I want to draw a contrast to this other kind of thinking. Jonathan Barron and some other psychologists call this actively open-minded thinking. And I'm going to draw a contrast between these two approaches. And for the record, this one is not atheistic, folks. I'm not making an argument for atheism. In fact, I would urge you to apply this to your atheism with as much rigor and aggression and zeal as you've applied it to the resurrection case or anything else. But here's how you do it. Instead of believing first and then reasoning second, first you conduct a broad open search for relevant evidence that is equally receptive to any outcome. You don't just go looking for the calls that went against your football team. You don't just go looking for the reasons that seem to support the Jesus case. You gather up all the relevant evidence, and you don't have any prior ideas about what that evidence means. So imagine a detective investigating a crime scene. I don't know who did it. I'm going to gather up all the information I possibly can, and then I'm going to see what the evidence compels me to conclude. So that's a case where it's evidence first, belief second. Analyze that evidence as impartially as possible. Draw the conclusion that is best indicated by the evidence, whatever that might be. Whether that's against your football team or for your football team. Whether that's against Jesus or for Jesus. You go where the evidence directs you instead of the other way around. Because when you do it the other way, the belief is directing the investigation. You believe something and you go looking for stuff to support it, right? And that's just completely ass backwards. All these conclusions need to be feasible. The goal is believing only that which is supported by the evidence. Now this is neutral with regard to God. This is neutral with regard to atheism. There's nothing atheistic about that. Now maybe atheism is the right conclusion that comes out of that process. Maybe it's not. Maybe, and in fact, for the record, I'll say, I can imagine a lot of circumstances where somebody would go through this and the reasonable conclusion for them to draw would be to think that God is real. I can imagine a lot of circumstances like this. In fact, we were just talking about Dan Barker, who visited this group or visited the area last year. And he started life as an earnest young preacher in an evangelical charismatic Christian movement. And I had a long talk with him about this. And knowing what he knew then and having the feelings he was having and having the sorts of convictions and experiences he was having, it seems to me that for the young Dan Barker, the guy who was 19 years old and raised in an evangelical church, and he was hearing these things and feeling the things he was feeling, it probably made sense. And it was probably quite reasonable for him to draw the conclusion he drew. But the mature Dan Barker looked back on that one and said, no, I think I was probably one of those people who was very suggestible, who was very easy to, prone to be persuaded by emotional arguments, and he makes a number of really interesting arguments about his deconversion. Okay, so this procedure is content neutral. It's neutral with regard to the outcome on the God question. Okay, so here's the two approaches then. Faith, seeking, understanding. Well, what do you do first? You believe Jesus Christ is our Savior first, and then you go encounter evidence and find a way to make it fit. So, sorry, but all those folks saw a little bitty blurb in the newspaper this morning about me saying something about Salem, and they all rallied and went out there and went to town without reflecting on any of this. Right? Sorry. Evidentialist approach, the actively open-minded approach I'm describing, you conduct a broad, unbiased search for evidence first, and then you draw the conclusion that's supported by the evidence. And see how they're inverted? See how the different direction works? And the thing is, you can often encounter people, you can have these discussions with people where two people who are on these two sides will have this discussion, and they sound like they're having a genuine disagreement. They sound like they're arguing. They sound like they're debating. We were talking about debates and the virtues of debates earlier. They sound like they're having a genuine debate. But in fact, they're coming from these two sides and they're completely talking across each other because one of them's over there and one of them's over here. Or maybe they're both over there. Not just about Jesus, but because of this prior conviction business. In which case, they're just making noise at each other and they're not about to change their minds. Well, look, we all ought to be doing more of this about everything. In fact, for the record, I'd rather make people into more thoughtful, reasonable, skeptical, rational folks than anything else. I don't really care about whether you're an atheist. Okay, so now what's my strategy then for talking to believers? Well, I don't think that continuing with the details about the Salem witchcraft argument is that productive. I don't think it's that helpful. I mean, we can talk about it some more. I'd be glad to talk about it with people. But that doesn't strike me as being the really central issue here. I think that what we can do is we can use it to demonstrate that people are guilty of motivated reasoning about Jesus. I think because the difference is so stark, the evidence is so poor about Jesus and it's so good about Salem, you've got to just put that out there and say, look at that. Look at the ridiculous double standard you're invoking here. You can't really think that we're supposed to take you seriously when you say that historical evidence in favor of the resurrection. That suggests to me that you're guilty of motivated reasoning. That your religious conviction is guiding your argument rather than the other way around. The Salem case shows that motivated reasoning and the Jesus bias are too clear to be. It shows the problem too clearly to be ignored. Okay, so let me wrap it up, and we can have some discussion. So I think the right answer here is there's no resurrection and no witches. You already don't believe in Jesus. Probably true of many of you in the room. The principles in the good sense that lead us to conclude that there were no real witches at Salem and many other conclusions are sound. I think that your reasons for thinking that there weren't witches at Salem are good ones, and you ought to trust those, and that those standards would lead you to reject Jesus in the same case. We shouldn't believe that Jesus came back from the dead for the very same reasons. Defenses of the resurrection spring from motivated reason. All right. Questions? Ideas? Yeah.
So, I appreciate your presentation, I'm sure, particularly the fact that you're coming from a prior Mormon background, as one of those 18-year-old fellows who used to be great people in for 2 years.
Yeah.
But I think from our perspective, when I'm speaking to family members who are still part of that way, the evidence moves around.
Right.
They don't really care.
Right.
They've had this sort of spiritual experience that trumps or supersedes anything we've talked about. So how do you reason with that? And
Well,
maybe you can. I mean, how would you?
It depends. Yeah. Well, you're right. That is a whole other big topic.
Yeah.
But I would resist your saying that they don't care about evidence, or that evidence doesn't matter in those cases. I think, at least judging from those folks who I've spoken to, that set of really profound, personally meaningful, intense emotional experiences, that's evidence. That's something, right? We can't just discount that. I think that really does mean something. But if we're going to talk about, you had this intense set of feelings while you were praying, or you had, there's some descriptions in psychology literature these days of elevation and sort of moral transcendence, and there's this set of sensations or feelings that goes along with it. Well, that counts for something. But notice now that's a different, if somebody goes, okay, I've had these really powerful experiences, and that's why I believe this thing. It's very different than saying, okay, well, we've got these scraps of papyrus, and they indicate that Jesus was resurrected. Okay, so separate arguments. And then I think the question is if somebody's really serious about that, okay, I can wear two hats here. Philosopher or psychologist. I'm not a very good psychologist. The philosopher wants to engage with the argument and say, okay, if your evidence is a set of feelings, do you really think you're you're giving the best explanation of this religious experience you've had? Is the best explanation for the feelings you had that the almighty creator of the universe was communicating with you? Maybe there's some other better explanation, right? And so that would be an argument about what's the most reasonable inference to make from the evidence, or from the event, from the evidence. But the other side of me says that, to toe the line about the motivated reasoning part, that look, perhaps there's motivated reasoning here that's driving the zeal that's disproportionate to the sort of experiences. And that one of the other issues here, that this comes up in some of the criticisms about the Salem argument, is that suppose we've got somebody who's fiercely committed about some part of the Mormon doctrine on the basis of those personal experiences. Well, give me 10 minutes and I can give you 100 other people who've had powerful, overwhelming, emotional, transcendent experiences that drew some other contrary conclusion that was incompatible with Mormonism on the very same sort of experience. So what are we supposed to make of all of that? Do they cancel each other out? Or where do we stand when all these different people are having these intense experiences and then they happen to say, oh, this corroborates the religion I grew up with? Well, there's probably a better natural explanation here. We know a lot about the psychology of it. But we're getting a bit far afield from my Salem point. There was another hand back here a minute ago. Yeah?
Do you think this conversation is about Christ or just the fallacy of human nature? Because if you go into the Salem witch trial thing, and like you said, there's a lot of documentation. There's still no evidence. In 30 or 90 years or 100 years, you say the same thing about the Salem witch trial and everything else happening in the Middle East. So at what point do you have faith in human nature?
I'm not sure if I follow. In general, about historical matters, I leave it to the historians to figure out what happened. But with this exception, that we know that there's a direct, let's see, how do I want to approach this? The exception I want to make about historical sources is about supernatural, magical, contra-natural events. So even though we get lots of, I'm not sure if I'm making the point the right way I need for what you're getting at. Here's one way to put it. Historians take it with a grain of salt when some Roman source says that Caesar had supernatural powers, or Caesar had magical powers. Kim Jong-il, before he died, was alleged to have magical powers. It was reported on the North Korean nightly news that the first time he went and played golf, he got 18 holes in one. And there was all these stories about his magical powers that circulated around. Now, the mere fact that something like that gets reported or widely believed is not enough, obviously, to establish it as a historical fact. So partly what I'm getting at here is that our standards, because of what we know about human psychology, because of what we know about people's disposition to believe in supernatural events and magical events, that those have to satisfy a different sort of standard. Because people, especially in the ancient times, people believed all kinds of stuff like that we don't take seriously. Historians don't take seriously. So Nuremberg doesn't disappear into history the way the resurrection does.
So then how is it different from today? Nothing else is different. I mean, we still watch shows that talk about ghost stories and Long Island TV, and there's all kinds of stuff out there on TV. They got ghost hunts up in Ireland.
There's a lot of bullshit out there. It's hard. There's a lot of work to be done here. Well, you're talking about cable TV. I mean, you're wanting me to. You're saying that ghost hunters is reliable historical information? Nobody thinks that's true. Yeah.
I'm just saying that a 2,000-year-old Jesus from today and there, you know,
right.
We're making a judgment that 100 years is a big significant difference. When, you know, here we can go home and type something on the computer and we can mass produce it. Back in, you know, 35 bishops, how many people can read, had access to paper, had access to writing,
right,
and all that kind of stuff. What's so, you know, what's really, you know, to say that something wasn't documented there, in comparison to how it's documented now, how is that? How do you weight that?
Well, that's not all there is to it, obviously. I think the short answer is that as the Salem case makes clear, I think, as I've made clear, that merely having a bunch of sworn affidavits or confessions is not enough to establish that somebody's a witch. So absolutely, we're not disagreeing about anything here. You're absolutely right about that. I think the standard of believing in magic ought to be even higher than the quality and quantity of evidence we have in Salem. So don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing there really was magic in Salem. There was a better natural explanation. So we need even better evidence than that in order to establish that something supernatural happened. So the historical evidence is for the resurrection is doubly bad. It's really bad because we have so little of it, and it's making this magical claim about this miraculous event. Yeah.
I'd like to ask, there's other documents from this time period, Pliny's letters and the Punic Wars, and we only have like 7 volumes of the Punic War document. We have bits of what Pliny wrote. But we have these documents, these 4 documents in Paul's letters and all. We have these solid documents from this period about Jesus and these things. How do you account for this difference?
Which difference?
The difference between the spotty fragments left of the Punic Wars, okay? Big book written by Caesar, I think, but we have these documents. Just 40 years after the writing, there's fragments showing up in Egypt of the documents about Jesus. But the documents of these other from the same time period, there's very little left. How do you account for the difference?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the factual claim you're making, but my understanding of the history here of the events is something like this. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, we have thousands and thousands of documents talking about Jesus. Well, in fact, the bottleneck is very narrow and very long for the decades I was describing. And then sometime especially into the 2nd and 3rd century, as the Christian movement, what we know now is the Christian movement. It wasn't really a Christian movement then. It was more and more groups sort of gathering and talking about this character. But as what ultimately becomes a Christian church starts to coalesce over 300 years, the number of these early documents start getting reproduced and copied. And this is not until the 200s and 300s, and then there's a huge proliferation then, afterwards, where we do get thousands of documents. But those are thousands of copies of the originals. So look, I mean, if I take, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, and I copy it 10,000 times, it doesn't make the original any less fiction. So you can copy something, and you can find as many repetitions of it as you like, but that doesn't lend credibility to the claim by itself. And I want to maintain, and I think you already know this, you already believe this, is that especially when ancient people are talking about magical events, and I know that term offends some people when you talk about Jesus as magic, but especially when we're talking about supernatural or miraculous events, we know good and well that as illiteracy goes up, as education goes down, as ignorance goes up, belief in these sorts of things skyrockets. We know that education and superstition and religiousness are inversely correlated. So as people get more educated, as they learn more, they believe in less of that stuff. So by the same, we know that for a fact about humans now, and we can project that back to the 1st century and think, and somebody just made the point, well, what happens when some illiterate sheep herders and fishermen who, don't have any of the advantages of a modern education, and what happens when they hear a story, or when they watch something like Ghost Hunters, right? Or they hear, or people talk, and I mean, they can't watch cable, obviously, but when people talk and when they tell stories the way that people are prone to tell stories, you can completely understand why somebody in the 1st century would repeat and believe a story like that. But those sorts of people are much less reliable about supernatural events, as the Salem case should make clear, right? So as for the document question, I don't know if I've really answered it, but I've found a number of people who seem to be under, this isn't you, but they seem to be under the misconception that we've got thousands and thousands of copies of the original documents or the original thing, and that's really just not the case. What we do is we have copies 200 or 300 years down the line of the ones I just described. Yeah?
You mentioned in the beginning about the art stores. Well, I don't know. I've done research myself. I know it's nothing conclusive whatsoever that Matthew, Luke, So Matthew, Mark, so Matthew and Luke counted on Mark for their source. Liberal scholars say that. There's a lot of conservative scholars who say Matthew did not draw from Mark. They were probably hung out, they might talked to one another, they might share things. But Matthew was a Levite. He was raised as a Levite. The Levites were the record keepers, raised in Israel. They, under penalty of death by God, then they sure John and Tittle is just right.
So you're arguing that Matthew is reliable? I'm just not following what you're getting at.
I want you to understand, because I wanted to ask you, what do you consider historical evidence? You talking about documents? You mentioned repeatedly the investigation about historical evidence, Salem witch trials,
right.
And you seem referring to written documents. Is that what you're saying?
We have some fragmentary copies from the second and third.
I just asked you, what is historical evidence in your opinion?
I was trying to describe it. We have some fragmentary copies of some of those Gospels from the second and third century.
I think what the gentleman may be asking, correct me if I'm wrong, is what would you accept perhaps as
No. I just asked,
evidence?
what is historical evidence, period? I want to understand your reasoning.
What is
historical evidence? Is it writing? Is it testimony? What is it?
Well, we don't have testimony. All we have is writing.
Okay. I didn't say about the Bible, sir. Open your reasoning, okay? I said, what is your opinion? What is your definition of historical evidence? So whatever. UFOs.
Perhaps you might
Yeti, whatever. What is your historical? What is your definition?
Well, there's a whole academic field here, and there's a huge list of things that get used. So take the Lincoln case. Take the assassination of Lincoln. If somebody wants to go investigate that right now, and they want to go figure out what happened on that night when Lincoln got assassinated.
They talk to witnesses?
Lincoln.
Do they talk to witnesses?
What you would go do if you were a graduate student in a program in history now, if you wanted to go investigate this question, what you would do is you go to the archives at some library. Hold on, I'll answer you. You'd go to the archives at some library and you'd find a bunch of documents. Because none of the people are alive.
So
you find a bunch of papers.
Thank you. All you could have told me was that written document.
Well, that's one example of historical evidence.
Okay, well, we can't talk to any witnesses because they're all dead, right?
In that case,
we can't
no.
talk to any witnesses of the gospel because they're all dead.
In that case, no.
Right?
Right.
So the historical evidence we've got to go on, based on your definition, is written documents.
In some cases.
Okay, I want to give you my own terminology. I call redirected intelligence. I'm basically going to get my job. There's 1,400 machines in my job that I'm responsible for. And I know there's 1,400 machines. I got a sofa right here with about 100 numbers in it. I know 2 of them by heart. Because I'm not counting on my mind to remember the numbers. It's in my cell phone.
Yeah.
Oral tradition is just as reliable as written documents, but it's actually someone that's learned that way and it's taught that way. Yeah. Before there was documents, before we had a printing press, people valued oral tradition passed on to them.
So
to this day, there are tribes who count on, and as just as historical to them,
yeah.
as your evidence to you,
yeah.
that the oral history is perfect.
Yeah, that's how I learned about Santa.
Because, again, because you talked about the reasoning, the motivated reasoning, because it's important to them. They remember every little bit and piece of that history.
So do you think I should, do you think that there was magic at Salem?
I didn't say anything about, I'm not talking about Salem. I'm
I
talking
am.
the Bible. I'm talking about the 4 Gospels. I'm talking the 27 books of the New Testament. What I'm saying is that
okay.
you're using your presentation here based upon written documentation. You don't talk about old tradition. You don't talk about, you actually put that down, because you mentioned before there was copies.
Yeah.
There was like 30, 40 years when people were talking about this, talking about that. So in a sense, you put down the old tradition.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is the short version. In my book, I spend a couple chapters on this, and there's probably 5 or 10 pages on the oral tradition question you're raising. So that'd be the place for us to take the broader discussion.
Okay, I want to tell you is that I understand.
Okay.
Sir.
Let me spread it out, and maybe we get some other folks to get some.
maybe at the end of this we can continue to do that. I know there's a lot of others. I know there isn't, but I know the others may have some questions. I want to make sure you spread Matt's time around. So maybe you can hang around a little bit after. We might be able to talk about it.
Here's my question.
All right, great.
Yeah.
This isn't really a question. I am the daughter of a retired police officer, detective. So I was raised to find the evidence. I am very open-minded, and that's why I'm here. This is my first atheist anything.
A lot of them are nicer than me. Just so you know.
I don't judge. I've been to agnostic meetings. I was raised Catholic and then Christian, and so I am very open. But a comment, going back to the death penalty thing we were using, my father was a police officer 30 years ago on the island of Maui. It was very small, very country. When the death penalty came around, when we had moved to California, a lot of the people's reasoning for voting in the death penalty was the Bible said an eye for an eye. And until you just said that clicked with me. Not a question, but being open-minded. That being said, and I have heard people testimony say, I voted for the death penalty because the Bible says an eye for an eye. That being said, people look at base the Bible on like that law, the death penalty, instead of looking at the pros and the cons and the goods and the bads and all of that. So my question to you is, as a fully open-minded person, this is my friend Warren, and he can explain his situation, but I listen to him too. How would you, other than the witches and the resurrection and all that, layman's terms, explain to me your position on how you believe what you believe. Don't use the resurrection and the Salem thing. Layman's terms, person to person. If I said, what are you all about? Explain it real quick.
We only have the room till about midnight, so.
Real quick.
You mean about religious matters?
Just.
I can't say anything real quick.
Okay, explain to
Give me a narrow question.
Explain to me why I should believe what you're saying. And don't give me anything you just said. Explain it to me as you're talking to a 13-year-old ninth grader.
I don't think you should believe in the resurrection because there's not very good evidence for it.
Okay.
That's it.
So what you're basically saying is you're basing, you don't believe in the Bible or anything. And this is the question. You don't believe in the Bible?
No, that was just a sentence about the resurrection.
Okay. Do you guys believe in the Bible? I mean, explain that to me. I don't understand what you're all about. You're non-believers.
Well, you could ask different people about that. I think as a source of moral guidance, and this won't get me any fans. Well, you guys might not mind, but I think as a source of moral guidance, it's pretty poor. And I think for some of the reasons I've described here about the historical origins of the document, it's important. It's obviously had a huge cultural impact. It's had a huge historical impact. It's spawned a worldwide movement of billions of people, and it's changed billions of people's lives. So it's obviously huge. It's a big deal. It's really important. But I don't find it to be useful morally. It seems to me to be dodgy history at best, for some of the reasons I've described. So it's of historical interest and cultural impact importance at most for me. But I think it's overrated, honestly.
Because I have found, and I am a member of another non-profit organization, I won't say the name, but I have found if you ask 10 people the same question, you're going to get 30 different answers.
Yep.
So,
that's right.
I'm asking you because you seem to be the one up there telling us, so you would know.
You got to draw your own conclusions.
Right here, I don't judge.
Yeah, you got to draw your own conclusions.
I'm just taking in everything you've said, and I think this is awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm wondering what you're thinking of the phenomenon where information from theologians and Bible scholars don't really trickle down into congregations. For instance, most scholars, biblical scholars, don't believe in the literal resurrection.
Right.
And they would tell you.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get down into the congregation. I'm wondering why that happens.
Yeah, we really got two worlds here, and it's really quite remarkable because, like I said before, were I to say lots of those things in a divinity school about the history of the New Testament, nobody in the room would have a problem with it. They'd all be, yeah, that's right, we know that, sure. What's your point, right? So amongst the people who do that hard history work, the ones who I think we should look to be the experts on it, they don't take it to be
And that's where you're
literal.
getting your information
Sure,
about the history
sure.
and
You know, one of the most gripping things that I've read in the last couple of years has been this work by Daniel Dennett and Linda Lascola. And she's a social psychologist. And they've actually found a bunch of pastors, preachers, and clergy who don't believe, who have lost their faith and they become atheists, but they still continue to preach and still continue to hold their jobs. And they've gotten these people to talk candidly about what they're going through because they can't speak out. And it's just amazing. You've got to take a look at some of this new book of hers. It's just remarkable because they're really quite candid. Because they say, I got into divinity school and I learned all this stuff, and it just completely destroyed the worldview I had that I learned in church when I was a kid. And I couldn't believe that this wasn't true. And they more or less taught us how to navigate around these problems in the congregations and not talk about it. So these days I have to just preach in ways that I can feel like more conscientious about without sort of saying the things that I think are just outright falsehoods.
Well, I think it would be impactful if you would add the sources of those things in your talk.
Yeah.
Because it would have been
Oh, well.
interesting to say this is coming from Christian theologians.
Well, I've got all of those, but I'm trying to sort of streamline to make it accessible.
Yeah.
My bibliography in the book is 30 pages long, so all that stuff's in there. Yeah.
One of the things that's kind of fascinating to me is the bias. When you have eyewitness accounts, you have to give sacred relief.
Yeah.
And you said that there were some natural explanations for the Salem witch witnesses. And I remember Arthur Miller did the Crucible, and he said that it was about a woman's lust and jealousy of God.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's true or not. But another thing is, I was wondering what might have been the motivation for the early gospels to tell this, aside from recounting accurate facts. What would they be giving?
You know, I'm more agnostic about a lot of this than some outspoken atheists. Partly because the lessons I learned here is we've just got so little information about this Jesus character and what happened. What we get is this sort of this record of the cultural movement that springs up afterwards. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens to the New Testament after these dates that I listed up here, where you get people who are deliberately tinkering and honing. And not only did these documents get replicated, but there was a proliferation of thousands of other documents where they told all these other different stories. Stories where Jesus wasn't resurrected, different gospels. There were thousands of other documents. But as the social and political movement of Christianity sort of coalesced and became more powerful in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, those were all lost or destroyed or burned as heretical, and they settled on one canonical view. And they said, this is the real story. And they weeded out all the other stuff. And we don't have a lot of those sources because they were deliberately destroyed so that we wouldn't get those. They were trying to sort of get the story straight and sort it out. Now, as for the motives of the originals, maybe they were genuine, earnest motives. Maybe these guys were telling stories that they'd heard and they genuinely believed them. I mean, belief in magic and miracles and events like this are rampant, even now, right? I get people, on a weekly basis who will testify to me with heartfelt conviction that they saw a ghost. Bereavement hallucinations are quite common, right? We know that amongst old couples, when one of them dies, as many as 80% of them will have full-blown hallucinations of the one who died. And this is a product of the way emotional centers in the brain react to trauma and memory and the way it works. And we know that the neurobiological mechanism of this. But somebody in the 1st century wouldn't have had any idea about that. You know, as much mileage as I'm getting out of this, I should go dig around and figure out what the consensus view amongst historians is about what really happened there. I know that the consensus view is that it wasn't magic. Nobody in the history department thinks it was really magic. But there's some other theories that get thrown around. So you probably heard about the rotten rye grain theory that led to this sort of LSD type hallucinations that some of the people may have been having. The little girls that started the whole thing had this strange behavior where they would act funny. They would run and freeze in these weird positions. And somebody has found a medical condition that's a result of cholera or typhoid or something that kids get sometimes as a result, where they act like that. And somebody suggested maybe the little girls were having symptoms of this illness, and then that thing sort of spiraled out of control and led to this, pogrom, led to this sort of mass hysteria. And the mass hysteria is a really fascinating phenomenon too. And there's been some contemporary cases where you get whole big groups of people get sort of carried away with some crazy idea, like Jonestown in Guyana or something. And afterwards, you just look at it and think, wow, what the fuck happened to lead all of these people to get... You can't believe the human brain, the number of humans can get wrapped up in something like that and get to those sorts of results. So I don't know the real answer to where are historians about the best explanation on Salem. Well, that's kind of embarrassing, now I say. In the back there.
I was convinced a few years ago through a documentary on TV that it had to do with a crop.
A what?
A plant farm crop.
Yeah, the right here.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you addressed that.
Rotten rye grain is one of the... Rotten rye grain and rye bread that had an ergot derivative molecule in it that resembles LSD is one of the theories. It's one of the theories. I don't know where it stands amongst historians. Yeah?
I have a question. Did you ever at one time believe in God? And if so, what was the point in your life that you changed or not believe?
So,
what about the change in not believing?
well, let's be clear. This has been an argument about the poor evidence for the resurrection. So don't make assumptions about broader conclusions. In fact, I don't think there's a God. Now, you want to know, how did I get there? I was a kid raised in a pretty traditional, evangelical, fundamentalist Christian church. And I got to about my high school 10th grade biology class and started learning some science and started putting two and two together and thought, this doesn't work. This can't all fit together. And it kind of unraveled from there. And then I went to my preacher and said, what about evolution? And he gave me some answers, and I went back and read some more. And I went back to my preacher and said, but. And he gave me some answers, and I went back and looked some more. And pretty soon, his answers just didn't jive. And I must have been 16, 17, and I thought, he's bullshitting me. Or he doesn't believe that, or I don't believe that. I can't buy that. It was scary. It was really scary. But I thought, that can't be right. All of these other people who are saying this for those reasons can't all be wrong for the reasons he says they're wrong. So I was trying to make, neo-Darwinism jive with my little country pastor. And it just wouldn't. The cognitive dissonance was too much, and it didn't work for me. So I want to spread it around and get some people who haven't asked yet.
Yeah, I'd like to know, you mentioned if you were to go to divinity school, this is what you would study. Have you been to divinity school?
Well, one of the things you do in religious studies, even an undergraduate program in religious studies, is you'll take like an introduction to the New Testament, introduction to the Bible, semester 1, semester 2, and you go through all of the basics of the history of the documents.
So have you read the whole Bible?
Yeah.
You've read the whole Bible.
Many
Have you ever
times.
heard of a book thing called Evidence and Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell?
I've heard that name.
There's a lot of historical content. You might want to add that if you like it.
Yeah, I think he gives one of those arguments that are in that network or that neighborhood of arguments that I outlined at the beginning. So the historical arguments for the resurrection, he's giving one of those. And I'm arguing that that's a faulty argument for the Salem reason.
Because of the numbers, because of the period of time when
A number of reasons,
did
yeah.
the comparison.
Quality and quantity of evidence. Yeah, that if we don't have enough quality and quantity of evidence to believe in magic in Salem, then why do we have it in the Jesus case? Right? Yeah.
So is this resurrection actually essential to the Christian beliefs?
I think if anything is, that
if
is.
you took that out, because I'm not really trained in religion. I don't know.
There's a few, I mean, all we can just do is look at the demographics here.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people who self-identify as Christians also subscribe to some view about the resurrection. Now, not all of them say it actually happened. Some of them are less literal about it. But it's really the idea of it, the notion of it is central.
So, and I understand why it was important to have something like that in the old days, because the early Christians were fed the Maya, so you need to believe that there was a reward, after reward. So Christ had this reward of being resurrected, I gather. And so maybe that was something important in the early movement, so that people actually would stick their necks out and get chopped off. So they had potential of also rising. I don't know. Maybe
it's all really complicated.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know
it's very complicated.
So.
But I think at the very least it's really central to Christianity because of the notion of atonement. That this act of self-sacrifice by Jesus, he pays a price for the moral infractions and the sins and the corruption of the rest of us. So that he takes the burden off of you, your guilt for the things, your misdeeds. He takes that off of you by this act of love and self-sacrifice. And so it has a symbolic value of giving you redemption and atonement for your misdeeds.
But what's that have to do with resurrection?
Well, he's divine, and it is symbolic of this resurrection in the afterlife.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think that fits fine with what the other studies. Yeah?
I'm more interested now in studying anything that you know of to read about the fact that whether there was an historical person that Jesus was patterned after.
That's a hot debate, and I know Bart Ehrman's got some opinions about it. His book, he must have a couple recent books about it.
He does, and Richard Carrier.
And Carrier
argues
is
the opposite side. He's going to be here in 4 months.
Carrier thinks that there was a Jesus character.
Was not.
Yeah. So Ehrman thinks that there was a man named Jesus, and Carrier thinks there was not.
That's correct.
Yeah. So Carrier, Richard Carrier, is going to be here, and Bart Ehrman, much better historians on this question than me. It doesn't make much difference to me. I can be neutral about that debate, because I can say whatever you all figure out about that, no resurrection. Give me a break. Jesus, no Jesus. If there's no Jesus, then there really wasn't a resurrection. If there was a Jesus, no resurrection. That's my little piece of territory.
As a free-thinking group, I would like to hear more.
Yeah.
The resurrection is not an issue with me.
No, this is a gripping question. I'm with you. I'd love to hear this one too. So I'll come down and listen to Richard Carrier too. Yeah.
Yeah, I have read, I've done a little studying on the Bible. I don't believe in the resurrection. I don't believe in God. My philosophy is I consider myself a Buddhist Gnostic, not an agnostic, but a Gnostic. And in reading and studying, and you talk about the Gnostics, haven't they come up with here recently that some of the Gnostic Gospels predate Mark?
I wouldn't be surprised. He said, he suggested that some of the Gnostic Gospels, which are much less well known and not part of the canon, may predate Mark. There may be some people arguing that, and that might be true. I don't know.
I was curious on that.
So there's this during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. There's documents that proliferate about this movement, and a whole bunch of them get sheared out, and around 275 or thereabouts. And the Bible as we know it gets sort of made. Thousands of documents, and a bunch of folks, more powerful political and social factions within this movement, a bunch of folks go, okay, this is the real set of sources. And they settle on what we know now as the Bible, and the rest of those all get sheared off and either, expunged, or some of them we still have, some get destroyed. And they, for the most part, tell very different stories, and they date all over this period.
That was at the Council of Nicaea.
Council of Nicaea is when the
Roman
modern Bible
by the
is.
name of Constantine, and some monks all got together and decided what would be put in.
And on
There's
that,
exceedingly detailed stories here about this 3 centuries.
on the topic of the Gnostics, we mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier and Richard Carrier. I don't remember which book, but I know for a fact that both of them address the claims and evidence and so on in their books.
Yeah, and Ehrman's going to be real good on this topic too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If the early church did this job of working out these documents so that they're so exactly what they want to say, how come they didn't clean up the problem of the 2 ways that Judas died?
Yeah.
And the Gadarene demoniac, was there 2? Was there 1? And some of these flaws, how come these flaws weren't flushed out when they did this careful...
Well, nobody's perfect. I mean, these are the kinds of details that anybody who works in a seminary or divinity school or a history department will say, well, look, these are the reasons why we think this is a sort of loose pastiche of all these different sources that get sort of stapled together. Now, I'm trying to state some of this neutrally because, I mean, imagine this from I can imagine this same discussion from the point of view of somebody who's defending the historical account. And here's what they might say. They might say, yeah, there were lots of mistaken stories circulating around the time about Jesus. And the reason they codified and canonized this set of documents is because they had good reason to think that these were the correct account of what was going on with Jesus, and the others were mistaken, hearsay, gossipy accounts, and that's why they get sheared off. And that's a really interesting point. It's a good point to make about that there's another way to understand canonization. Now, the way I laid out in the book is that you can sort of think about it as, there's roughly 2,000 years and all this time and place and people between you and Jesus. And you're getting transmitted this information about this guy through all these layers of filters. And so the question is, from your perspective in 2014, what's the reasonable thing to think about what's on the other side of all that stuff between you and Jesus? And like I say, I'm surprisingly agnostic about this. Once I sort of understand what I think I understand about what stands between me and Jesus, I go, oh, I'm not willing to throw down about much of anything here, given how much and how bad and how filtered and distorted and how much happened between me and that. Yeah.
We'll just do one more question.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question. Considering atheism versus Christianity, obviously you'd be considered an atheist speaker. I don't know what you guys call them, motivational speakers or informative speakers. Now, Christians are driven by passion to see people encounter what they encounter, whether it be experience, information, or what drives you as an atheist. You spend your life trying to disprove something you don't believe in. And also trying to disprove something supernatural when you don't clearly believe in the supernatural. So, Christians believe there's an unseen world, angel beings, obviously. The Sadducees didn't believe that. The Pharisees did, which is why they're always arguing in the gospel.
Sorry, dude, you're going fast.
Okay.
Give me a question.
Well, you said last question for the time, so
it's a lot of details here.
So I'm asking as an atheist, just a question of what drives atheists to passion, because you spend your life disproving through intellectualism and through, we don't have documents, which, we're saying that we believe in something that happened 4.6 billion years ago, which is evolution, but we don't believe in something that happened 2,000.
Dude.
So I'm asking you, what drives you to atheism? You're trying to disprove something you don't believe in through natural means. You want to disprove a supernatural encounter or a supernatural experience.
I'm not really hearing a question. I'm kind of hearing an argument or a criticism.
No, I'm asking the difference between Christian and atheism, and what drives the motivation. Why should we spread atheism and free thinking when is comparison, what's the passion? Does that make sense? Because I'm saying
Okay.
there's a reason why you're passionate, right?
Hold on. Hold on. I got the question, I'll answer it.
Can I ask
No.
It's a very simple question. You talk a lot.
Well, hold on, guys, hold on.
It's very simple.
I think the professor understands your question. Let's give him a chance to answer.
Okay. Do you understand the question?
Yeah.
I want to make sure it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good. I kind of have to translate because you've got a different perspective here. I don't mean to be patronizing, but imagine saying something like that to a doctor. Here you've devoted your whole life to fighting all this negativity and disease and harm and illness and pain and suffering. And your life is just, what motivates you to just be trying to get rid of all this stuff out there? And it seems strange to sort of question my motives. I don't know what, I don't really know what's going on there.
An hour talking about, how wrong, the 2.2 billion.
What motivates me is that that view is mistaken.
Okay, that's what I'm asking.
It's irrational.
That's my question. What motivates you as a speaker? I'm just
The
asking.
world's a better place the more people reason well.
So the world's a better place.
I'm going to use my power as the organizer today to add on to this. When I was in 6th grade, I fondly remember, not fondly is the wrong word, I remember this girl who sat next to me. Her name was Elizabeth. And every day, and I think a lot of you know this, first thing you do when class starts is what? Pledge of Allegiance. And we all did it. I did it too. I even said under God. It's just what you do. The girl next to me didn't. She didn't stand. She didn't say anything. And it only took 3 or 4 days before other kids in the school or in the classroom noticed her. And eventually she was known as the girl who didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. And everybody else has their personalities. You guys remember what it was like in elementary school. You're the hot one, you're the cool one, you're the sporty one, you're the nerd. I was the nerd. Surprise. Right. She was the one who didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I didn't understand why until about 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, and she said that she's Jehovah's Witness. I didn't get it. I didn't even know what that meant. But she felt like such an outcast because that was her thing. And I run a children's camp now. I mentioned earlier Camp Quest. And every summer I get to hang out with about 100 kids who are very much like Elizabeth. They're not witnesses, they're atheists. And when they go to school, they're the ones who don't go to church. They're the ones who grandma admonishes and says that they're going to hell for not believing. They're the ones who are politicians and sometimes our teachers, sometimes our elected officials and our friends and family members tell us that we're wrong. And Matt mentioned, science and doctors who are trying to do the right thing in their eyes and in our eyes, and we keep going like this against our religious brothers and sisters. Stem cell research, women's rights, contraception, abortion, family planning. That's why we're here. I want to thank you guys so much for coming. It's getting late, and I know some of you want to go. I know this guy's got to go all the way back to Sacramento. How about another round of applause for him? And all the folks who helped put this together, all our volunteers for setting things up. I want to thank the 2 churches across the park who came by while Matt was talking and prayed for us. That was great to have too. That's right, that's great. And again, I encourage you to go online, to don't take what Matt has told you for face value. Don't believe his dogma. I want you to go home. I want you to go on YouTube. I want you to read the Bible. I want you to read all the books. I want you to go to our page and the Stanislaus Humanist page. And I want you to join or find out more and like us on Facebook. And on your way out, if you feel so inclined, grab some literature, drop a couple bucks into the jar. Stick around if you want. If you have more questions, I'm going to be here, but I know a lot of you have some driving to do. So thank you guys so much for coming out here. Have a great weekend.